you're live.
Yep, you've just gone live.
Excellent. Hello everyone, great, good to see you all here, and I can see more and more numbers are coming in. That's very good to see. All of you are welcome to watch and to type in your questions in the comments box. I obviously won't be able to get to all of them, but I will do a few. I just want to thank you all for joining this campaign by the Indian National Congress social media team, which is focused on the burning issues facing the country today, particularly asking for Speak Up India. That is, where people can raise their voice for the protection of the poor, the middle class, and the micro and small enterprises in our country at this particularly challenging time of the COVID pandemic, as well as, of course, the lockdown and the consequences thereof. This is sort of a virtual dharna. What we're trying to do is to actually get all of you involved in understanding what the key issues are and in coping with the challenges that are facing the nation. I want to tell you all that our message is very simple and very clear. Some of you have already seen this message in my Twitter and Facebook posting last night, where we have in fact made two very simple pairs of requests. The first is to transfer 10,000 rupees immediately to families below the poverty line. This is something which is indispensable because a number of people have found it impossible to make ends meet. We have found themselves, especially daily wage workers, do not have an opportunity, as you know, to earn a living during the lockdown. They have found themselves in a position where they cannot do a job, earn the money, and put the food on the table at the end of the day, which means that we are looking at people facing a little short of destitution. It is indispensable that they be given the immediate resources to be able to cope. And we have the Jan Dhan accounts. We have a number of other means of reaching money to the poor. Secondly, the migrant workers have stirred the conscience of the nation. We have seen how very moved most people are by the plight of these hard-working men and women reduced to trudging on the hot tarmac of the highways, heading out to their homes, back to their home villages. And I think one thing that most people I speak to would agree with is that transport should be made available for all migrant workers without charge so they can get back home safely. Employment opportunities must be provided to them once they get home. And this is why, linked to this request, is our request that the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme should not just be activated but should be doubled so that we actually have 200 days of paid employment given, and that can also be used to strengthen the infrastructure in our villages. Many of us remember President Abdul Kalam talking about what he dubbed Pura, providing urban facilities in rural areas. It is time for us to make his dream a reality by having the government contribute to actually strengthening what the rural areas can offer people, and maybe even moving some of our white-collar jobs to the rural areas. After all, if you're in a business processing office where all you're doing is sitting at a computer terminal or a telephone line dealing with consumers, customers, you don't have to be in a crowded, congested city. You could as easily be in a rural area, provided that rural area has guaranteed 24/7 electricity and decent broadband. And our big challenge, as we all know, has been that that is not always available. I do want to say to all of you that when we talked about transferring money to poor families, we haven't forgotten the businesses. The businesses in our country are businesses that for the most part are small, micro or medium enterprises. A micro enterprise is just 2 to 7 employees. A small enterprise can have several dozen more, but not very much more than that. And a medium enterprise is still under 500 people. Think of those small enterprises running a little workshop, for example, or a lathe, and this enterprise gets its job order in the morning. It actually then proceeds to come back, execute the job, pay its workers. The workers go home and they're able to eat. The job is done and the business is able to continue. That kind of enterprise is in deep trouble. We already saw literally lakhs of such enterprises being forced to close because of the ill-considered demonetization. Right now, we are seeing the great risk that unfortunately this may happen once again when the lockdown prevents them from being able to work. Now, we have hundreds of requests from people to come into the live video. That isn't going to be possible because obviously we can only meaningfully do one person at a time, and there are literally 1,300 requests. So I'm hoping you're all watching this video and you're welcome to type in your questions. I see 1 or 2 questions have already come in, and let me address them right away. The first question is, how do you think the government could have handled the issue of migrant workers, and what could they have done to limit the chaos and the panic we witnessed? Let me say, and there's a second related question, is this a really big problem we have, frankly, is that planning is not has not been a priority for this government. It's interesting that when the Janata curfew was announced on a Sunday, as you remember, we were given 48 hours notice to prepare for a quiet Sunday at home, and the nation responded very well until the unfortunate incident of coming out in the evening and banging thalis and drums and so on to celebrate their successful curfew. The fact, however, is that if you really look at what exactly was done, people had 2 days to plan their Sunday. And then suddenly, on the Monday night, we got 4 hours notice, in many cases by the time the PM had finished, 3.5 hours notice to suddenly shut down everything for what was meant to be 21 days and, as you know, has now become 60 days. And the problem with that is that nobody was able to make any arrangements. What we would have preferred be done by the government was that the government make this announcement 10 days earlier and give people that much notice. 10 days earlier was certainly feasible because it was very clear by the end of February the World Health Organization had already declared COVID-19 to be a pandemic, and it was very clear by that time that it was essential for people to actually take steps to lock the nation down. The government was already discussing it. Unfortunately, I think, in my personal view, that a short-term political objective, that of defenestrating the Madhya Pradesh government, took priority over a lockdown. Because, for example, Parliament remained open till the 23rd of March, even while parliaments elsewhere in the world were being suspended. And the reason at that time was very clearly that if our parliament had been suspended because of COVID, then the Madhya Pradesh Assembly would also have had to be suspended and the government of the Congress party could not have been brought down. Be that as it may, and I know that many of you don't want me to speculate on political motives, the fact remains that what happened with the government was they took a decision somewhat later than they needed to, and the decision they took was taken with no notice at all. When there is no notice at all, what happens? People are simply unable, as you know, to decide what to do with themselves. Those who felt they had no choice but to go home could not go home, and the result has been, very sadly, the kind of chaos, the tragedy, the suffering we've seen on the streets. Equally, the government, in announcing this, could have also made it simpler for employers to make arrangements. It could have forbidden evictions. For example, many factory workers sleep in their factories. They don't have other accommodations. When the factories were shut down, they not only lost a job, they lost a home, a roof over their heads. That was why many of them started walking back to Bihar and UP from places like Mumbai and Gujarat. Well, if the government had said no evictions would be permitted, that arrangements had to be made, that would have helped. If the government had announced, as for example the British government did, I'm not a great fan of the British, but they did something very right, and it was an Indian finance minister there who did it. He said, we will pay employers up to 80% of the wage of the people they choose not to fire. That would be as effective a way of getting money to people. If the employer only has to pay 20% of the salary, or has to expect their workers to take a 20% pay cut rather than lose a job, the government would then have been able to send this money to people. And I want to stress this because very, very clearly, none of this was contemplated. A lockdown was announced. The very next morning, police were out on the streets with lathis to enforce it. But as we all know, very sadly, the lockdown was at best a pause, and that too not a very long pause, because when the lockdown was announced, we had 500 COVID cases in India. Today we have 1.5 lakh COVID cases almost, and the number is climbing every single day, and each day's numbers are greater than the previous days. In the last 9 days alone, over 500,000, over 50,000 cases have happened in India, while the lockdown has still not finished. Now, this has become a very, very serious problem. So that's my answer to the question about the state government and the central government. I believe the central government invoked the provisions of the National Disaster Management Act to ride roughshod over the state governments. The state government's authority was taken away from them, and the central government decided on the lockdown, and the state governments were not in a position to do anything about this. So it was a state government decision. Flights would end, trains would end, interstate buses would end, local transportation would be wound up, and the lockdown would be enforced at the point of lathis. That surely was not a state government's decision. It was all done by the central government, and therefore I'm afraid if you have to point fingers, it can only be pointed at the central government. Another question has come in: has the government to help, as stranded students in Kota, or stranded farm workers in Punjab, or stranded migrant workers in other states, all of whom we support their right to go home. There is absolutely no reason why we should not have allowed the Pravasis to go home as well. I do want to stress, however, that when you look at the way in which the Pravasis have been asked to pay their own tickets, it's been a bit unfortunate. I've had the privilege of serving in our outstanding ministry, and at that time, no one talked about asking them for any money. Years earlier, before I was back in India or in government, I was working at the UN then, India evacuated people from Kuwait, and it didn't ask them to pay their tickets. So it's a bit unfortunate that what has been advertised as the Vande Bharat mission turns out not to be a government mission, but turns out actually to be an exercise in purely telling people that you can go back home, but provided you pay your way. And that, I think, has been a bit unfortunate. Of course, many of them were also asked to go through tests that they were not always finding it possible to undertake. Tests, for example, that required them to how can I put it very bluntly, go through hoops in their countries. In many places, it wasn't convenient, particularly for our poorer members of our population, to go and get themselves tested and to come with COVID-free certificates to board our flights. Not all of that was done as well as it could have been. But for those who've come back, I've received many hundreds of messages from returning Pravasis thanking the government, myself, others who've intervened for them for their support. So I think it was the right thing to do. One more question that has come down is, of course, the worry about the unemployment crisis in the country. Here, I have to say the situation was already pretty bad before COVID struck. Our unemployment situation was the worst in 45 years, 7% unemployment, which in a country where the historic low has ever been 8%, 7% has been very, very serious. But what has happened, in fact, is that not only did we have 7% unemployment, but now, thanks to COVID, that has gone up to 27% unemployment. This is why we are urging that Manrega workday should be doubled, so people actually have a financial means of earning a living and being able to live. They should be put in productive activities in the rural areas to strengthen rural infrastructure and to build up the rural facilities. And they should also undoubtedly have been given a chance, it seems to me, to ensure that as far as the employment in small, micro, medium enterprises are concerned, that they were given some buffer of protection by the central government. I talked about this earlier. If they had given, for example, either a salary guarantee for their very modest number of employees, that the central government would pay 80% of the salaries, they've been given other kinds of subventions, not in forms of loans, because they are living so close to the margin that paying loans back would not have been realistic. If that had all been done, I think we would have been in a very different position. Thank you all for these questions. I see most of the questions that are coming in are quite repetitive of these three, in addition to which, as you know, I'll recap very quickly the points that I have made in terms of the fulfillment of the Indian National Congress's Speak Up India movement. Number one, we need to transport the workers back to their home villages. It's too late now to keep them safe where they were working because they haven't been working for 2 months. Let them go home, transport them back. Second, double up the number of work days permissible under Manrega, give them paid employment for 200 days in their rural villages. Number three, give a 10,000 rupee immediate grant to the people below the poverty line in their Jan Dhan accounts. Transfer the money right away so people aren't starving in India, which would be a blot on our country. And number four, give grants, not loans, to the micro, small and medium enterprises so they can actually function, they can employ people, and they can generate work in our economy again. There's a lot more we can talk about, a lot more that needs to be done, but we want to keep this virtual dharna, this Speak Up India campaign focused on these issues alone. I've enjoyed talking to you all and responding to some of your questions, at least the questions that came up most often. Thank you all very much. We will release a